Let's go. Well, g'day ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another wet week, for me at least, in this part of the world. But here for our weekly tutorials, where I'm coming to you week after week, helping you to walk through the Bible story as it happened. We are now up to week number 9 on our 2025 Chronological Bible-in-a-Year Reading Challenge. I trust you're enjoying it so far. This week, we're going to be hitting into the book of Deuteronomy. All right, Deuteronomy is the 5th and final book of the books of Moses, or sometimes called the Torah or the Pentateuch, in Greek, pent meaning five books. There you go, pretty straightforward. From a chronological perspective, Deuteronomy follows naturally and normally immediately on from the book of Numbers, where we left off last week. God's people, the second generation, all right, the next generation of people out of Egypt after 40 years of being, or 38 years of wandering in the desert. Moses is speaking to that generation as they are poised to enter the promised land, okay? They've just spent the last 38 years basically burying their parents and their grandparents, really. 1.2 million approximately people of military age, so 20 years age and over, died off in the desert. Works out to about 89 funerals every day. Okay, sounds a bit morbid, but this is basically a reminder to them, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, for 40 years, okay, of the consequences of being disloyal to God's covenant. What we saw with this, the story of the 12 spies, where they refused to enter the promised land. So now Moses is speaking to that next generation, their children, okay, 40 years later, to say, let's not make the same mistake as your parents and your grandparents, okay? So Deuteronomy, a really key book. It's actually one of the most quoted books in or throughout the rest of the Bible, okay? Deuteronomy, including the New Testament and Jesus himself. I think you're going to notice that this week. You're going to notice some very familiar passages. If you've been reading the Bible for a while, you'll notice that this week. Historians and those who study the ancient world, or the ancient Near East, tell us that Deuteronomy is structured very similar to other ancient treaties of that part of the world. It has a lot of similarities to it, to the law code of Hammurabi, who was a famous king of Babylon. It's also apparently very similar to many Hittite and Egyptian treaties. And so that also reflects part of Moses' education. Okay, remember, he was trained in the top royal training of Egypt, and Moses brings that out as he writes this document, because here we have Moses's, and this is probably the most important thing, Moses's final words, all right, his final opportunity to speak to this people before his passing. And so what we see here this week, in particular in the first 26 chapters, is where Moses feels it is absolutely vital. What's his last departing words going to be to this people? Well, Moses senses the need to remind the Israelites of their past in order to prepare them for their future. Moses feels it's important to look back before they move forward. And in fact, that's what the word Deuteronomy means. It comes from two words, deuteros, which means second, and nomos, which means law. It's the second reading of the law to the second generation that are about to enter the promised land. And so what we see this week, unfortunately, well, just prepare yourself for this anyway, is a lot of repetition, okay? Moses is repeating, he is recalling, he is remembering, he is restating, he is reiterating, he's reflecting, he's re-emphasising and retelling the stories of their past, and also the stipulations of their past that God gave them a whole generation ago back at Mount Sinai. Okay, Moses wants to be absolutely certain that he can leave this planet with a clear conscience, okay, being absolutely confident that he has done all he can to communicate to this generation of Israelites the importance, the vital importance of trust and obedience toward God, of faithfulness, of covenant loyalty, the covenant that he made with them at Mount Sinai, and especially, you're going to notice this a lot this week, when it comes to the first of the 10 commandments, of not having any other God besides Yahweh. You're going to see that over and over again this week, Moses emphasizing the point of not committing idolatry, of having no other God but him. That is a constant message that comes through Deuteronomy this week, and particularly and specifically because idol worship was a massive thing in the Promised Land. And so as God's people go into that land, he wants to tell them, don't become like the nations there. You must worship no other God but Yahweh. And one of the ways that he does this, and I found this quite amusing actually this week, is Moses uses a whole bunch of different words to make that one point. You know, he says that you are to worship God and God alone, that you are to obey him and him alone, to love him and him alone, to follow him and him alone, to fear him, to serve him, to remember him, to revere him, to hold fast to him. It's like Moses got a thesaurus and was just like all the words, okay, just to make this one point. It is God, Yahweh, and Yahweh only that you are to follow and that you are to worship. And there's essentially two main reasons for Moses emphasizing covenant loyalty. The first is this, that's the covenant that they are in, where God says, if you are faithful, I will be faithful. Okay, that's what he says at Mount Sinai. If you are loyal, I will be faithful and loyal to you. So if you are faithful to me, you will possess the promised land. It will go well for you. You will live a long life. I will scatter your enemies before you. God says, I will be faithful to the promises I made to Abraham, your ancestor, if you are faithful to me first. It's very much part of the if you do, then I will do contract or covenant that God had with them. And of course, with that comes covenant disobedience and curses. As a result of that, we're going to really see that next week. I won't mention that here, but that's one of the main reasons Moses wants to emphasize covenant loyalty, because it's only when you obey in this covenant that God will be loyal and faithful to you in return. But this week there's also a second reason given as to why God's people should be loyal and faithful to his covenant, and it's simply this. If they are loyal to God's covenant, they will serve as a good example or as a good witness, okay, to the nations around them. They will serve as a model where the other nations will look at them and go, wow, what kind of wisdom do these people have? They're different. They are wise. They are blessed. There's something about them that stirs us to envy and jealousy and arouses our interest to go, what kind of God are they serving? He is obviously a greater God than ours. Okay, so one of the reasons for their covenant obedience is to be a good witness and basically a shining light to the nations around them. All right, so take a note of that this week. The point is, there is a great deal of repetition and reminding and remembering and reiterating this week. Prepare for that. That is what is ahead of you as we look at the second law. However, there's another something else that happens this week that I really want you to pay attention to. There are a number of first mentions, things we have not heard before, all right, that point to their future. So don't switch off. Don't just think, oh, I've read all this, I've heard all this before. No. There's some things coming this week that's brand new information that we really need to take note of. And I want to highlight three things specifically. When Moses prophesies or Moses predicts a future place, a future king, and a future prophet. Place, king, and prophet. First of all, he mentions over and over again a future place. And he basically uses this phrase. It's a place, God says, where I will put my name. When you enter the promised land, you take possession of it, you drive out your enemies, you live in the promised land. There is a future place in that land where I will put my name. All right, it's in one of the tribal lands. He doesn't say which one it is yet, okay, but it's a special place where my presence will be in a special way. God's altar will be there. Your sacrifices are to be brought there. The festivals are to be celebrated there. God's sanctuary will be placed there. Now, you and I know, or you're probably guessing already, that this place is Jerusalem, okay, or will be Jerusalem. And that doesn't happen, though, for another 400 years. So Moses is predicting something that is centuries into the future. And essentially, you should think about it like we do the Garden of Eden story, all right? In Genesis 1 and 2, God has Eden, then he has a garden, and then he has a tree of life, okay? Eden is like the promised land. The whole of Canaan is where God's presence is. God is present in that land. That's like the land of Eden. But within Eden, there was a garden where there was an extra dimension of God's presence. Well, that's this place, okay, Jerusalem, okay? There's Eden, a garden, and then a tree. There's a promised land, there's Jerusalem, and then there's the temple or the sanctuary. We don't know it's a temple yet, but the sanctuary within that place. So it's very much this three-tiered structure of the intensity, if you like, of God's presence. All right? But that's number one. God is promising a future place where I will put my name. The second thing Moses predicts is a future king. All right, he says, after you settle in the land, you will ask me for a king. And essentially their governance will change. They'll become a monarchy. All right, and he gives some very special warnings about this king. He says, you've got to make sure that that king knows he is not above the law. In fact, what I want him to do is have his own version of the Torah. I want him to write it out by hand so he can read the Bible for himself. That king needs to know he's not above the law, that Yahweh ultimately is the king, and he, just like all the subjects of the kingdom, must obey God's law as well. So he emphasizes that. And he also gives these very specific warnings and predictions about the king to not trust in the number of horses that he has and the size of his army, basically, and to not take for himself many wives, because those wives will lead him into worshipping other gods. Again, idolatry kicks into here. So there's this very specific prophecy of Moses, which is you and I, you've read your Bible any length of time, will know you're immediately thinking of Solomon, aren't you? Saul, David and Solomon fulfill that kingdom, that asking for a king, and of course Solomon with his many wives, well, disaster happens. But the point is, 400 years before King Saul and David come on the scene, Moses is predicting a future place and a future king. Well, number three, he predicts a future prophet. And Moses says this will be a prophet who is just like me. Like me. He will be like a mediator between God and the people. God's words will be in his mouth, and you better make sure you listen to him. Because if you don't listen to this future prophet, you will be cut off from my people. He won't be a military leader like Joshua. No. I'm not talking about Joshua now. I'm not talking about Joshua being the future prophet. No, there is a prophet coming who will speak my words. And by the time we get to the first century in Acts chapter 3, Peter is there preaching at the temple, okay? And guess who he says fulfills that prophecy? Who is the prophet? Like Moses, same, but superior, like Moses, that will come? Well, of course, it's Jesus. And if you want to, when you get to that passage in Deuteronomy, you want to do some research this week, maybe one of the things that you can nerd out on is the similarities between Moses and Jesus. There are so many similarities as Jesus comes as the future prophet. All right, so pay attention to those future predictions of all the reminding, all the recalling, all the reiterating, all the remembering that happens in the repetition that happens in the book of Deuteronomy. Pay attention this week to those three future predictions: a future place, future king, and a future prophet. You see, just as we have seen in the past, Moses is a deliverer leader, a miracle worker, and a song leader, in the Exodus story. We've seen Moses as a lawgiver and sanctuary builder. We've seen Moses as a shepherd and military leader. Well, this week, and especially next week, we are going to see Moses as a prophet, a predictor of things to come. And as I just hinted at, that is especially true as we close out the book of Deuteronomy next week. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. This week we are looking in the past so we can prepare for the future. We're recalling what has taken place so we can prepare ourselves for the promised land. And guess what? We're 1/5 of the way through the whole Bible when you finish this week. Enjoy your readings, guys. And we'll catch you next week as we close out Deuteronomy and head into week number 10. Bless you heaps. Bye.